Hello and welcome. Today we are talking about the clutch. This type of clutch here is called the dry clutch. It's called the dry clutch because, as the name suggests, it doesn't need any lubrication. The wet clutch lubrication system means that this kind of clutch, or that particular kind of clutch, is running, or it operates inside that lubricant or the oil. Now this kind of clutch, the dry clutch, these are the components that make it up. We have the release bearing over here. This one sits in here. We have the pressure plate, this one, this pressure plate here. We have the disc, the friction disc, or the clutch disc. Now if you are careful, if you look at this clutch disc over here, we have the hub. This hub has its important role that we'll have to discuss shortly. We have the torsion springs again. I'll have to explain to you what it does. We have the pressure plate over here. I'll also explain to you what it does. We have the cover here. Then we have the diaphragm springs. Then inside it again, we have this kind of arrangement, this spring here. I'll also explain to you what it does. Now if we start here with this friction disc, what it does, you see, when you are on a full stop or when you are on a traffic jam, this is what happens. This particular part over here, this friction disc, this surface over here, it meshes with the flywheel of the engine. Now what happens when you press your foot in, when you press your foot inside, what happens is that this bearing over here, all that you're doing is that you are pressing this bearing, you are pressing it inside. Now as you press it inside, these diaphragm springs will have to be pressed, they'll be pressed inside, and as that happens, you see, it has some tension. Now if you press it in, it disengages, it disconnects this plate over here from this surface over here. Now that disengagement disconnects the motion from the engine that comes in to the transmission through this particular arrangement over here. Now as you put your foot on the brake, this is what happens. Just be a little careful. Now as you press your foot on the pedal, there's this displacement, this is too wide, but then this is what happens. The engine disengages from the gearbox. Now as you release the foot again from the floor to the floor, the connection continues. When you press the foot inside, disengagement happens. When you release the foot from the pedal, connection continues. Then the motion comes from the engine through this connection to the input shaft of the gearbox or the transmission. Now what happens when you want to start off from a full stop? Or let's say this, what happens when you want to do a hill start? Let's say you are stuck in a traffic jam and you want to start off smoothly. Now this particular springs over here plays a very important role in you doing the hill start or the balancing of the pedals. What happens when you try to disengage, or when you try to press in the foot? Let's put it this way. Now when you press in your foot, remember you disengage it this way. Let me hope it's clear a bit. When you press in your foot, this is what happens, you disengage this. Now as you release your foot back to the floor, this is what happens. Now let's say you want to have a smooth takeoff. Remember your foot is already in, then you want to release it slightly so that you can take off. Remember the weight of the vehicle and also the gradient of the where you are, it has to be, all those efforts, that force has to be countered. Now this springs over here is what does that. It counters the force, and also the force and also the weight of the vehicle. Now let's say you're uphill. Remember, when you're uphill, there are very many forces that are acting upon the vehicle. There is the force of gravity that's trying to pull the vehicle behind. Now that force of gravity that is pulling the vehicle behind has to be uh, reacted upon. Now the reaction force will have to be compensated by this particular kind of coil springs here. How is that achieved? Now let's say the spline is in here. Now as you try to lift your foot off the clutch pedal, there will be a slight some friction that will be happening. Remember, the engine is spinning and you're trying to lift your foot off. Now the engine will keep on rotating, and this friction disc again will keep on rotating. Now as you try and lift your foot off the pedal, you'll notice that there's still continuous, there's still motion, there's still some motion that is happening over here. And that in the process, these particular torsion bars, these coil springs over here, absorb that shock. They absorb that particular, they react to that force that is applied to the vehicle. That's the force of gravity, and also the weight that is on the vehicle. So these springs over here, they do that part so that you can have a smooth takeoff. Now in the process, as you try to engage and disengage your foot, as you try to step and leave your foot off the pedal, now remember that this particular surface of here will create some friction. Now the friction will happen between this particular pressure plate over here and this surface at the friction disc. And you see, with time, this surface over here will have to get worn out. It will wear out with time. Why? Remember, when the two body parts rub against each other, the surface is worn, and again heat is produced, and in the process you notice that the friction that is coming out of that particular reaction will have to wear this particular friction disc down. Now this is a worn out one. As you notice, if try and look at it, it was worn until these particular metals that are these stars that are holding the friction disc together were reached. Now in the process, you see this particular area over here, this part, the pressure plate should not be as smooth as it is now. It has to be rough. There's some sort of, it is designed to be rough so that as you press, as you relieve your foot off the clutch pedal, there is that intact grip between this pressure plate and this friction disc. Now with the time, as the engine keeps spinning and this friction disc keeps spinning, those surfaces wear out, and in the process you have to replace this whole component. That is, when you're doing the replacement of this particular friction disc, you do it alongside this pressure plate. Why is it so? Let's assume you've put a new friction disc and you've not put a new pressure plate. Remember, you'll be having grip over here, but then you won't be having grip over here. So it means with time you'll start losing again this particular surface so fast because of the roughness, the smoothness of this particular pressure plate here. You won't be having enough grip to hold this friction disc to the pressure plate together. Now another important thing to note is that these diaphragm springs over here, you might wonder how they help in holding the vehicle together, or in operating, or let's say transmitting the motion from the engine to the transmission. Yes, these diaphragm springs have been bolted with studs over here. Now as you fit the bolts to the flywheel, the bolts come tightened through here. One, two, these holes, they are bolted to the flywheel. Now as you bolt it to the flywheel, it looks like this. So you've bolted it to the flywheel. So this whole thing, it will be one unit. This one unit will be held in the flywheel, so it will be spinning as a unit. So as the engine is turning, this whole thing will be turning. Now that is only achieved when you this particular cover is bolted to the flywheel. These diaphragm springs will have to hold itself even much tighter to the flywheel, and in the process this clutch here, this friction disc, cannot slip on this surface. It should only slip when you have pressed your foot here. When you pressed your foot in here, you press it inside, so that as you press it in, this spring here causes a leverage, and that particular leverage disengages this pressure plate from the friction disc, and by doing so, motion is disconnected from the engine and you can engage your gears smoothly. You might ask, now what are the signs, or how do you know that this particular friction disc is worn, or you're trying to lose your clutches? Well, first symptom is that you'll have to, as you engage your gears, you'll have some difficulty. That is engaging the first few gears. You'll be struggling so much after you've pressed fully the brake pedal inside. Another symptom that indicates that this particular component is worn, well, you might be uphill trying to take off uphill, but then after you engage the takeoff gear, that is 1 or 2, the vehicle you feel like as if it's lagging so much. You feel like it's straining to pick up from that particular point. Again, when you've loaded the vehicle, and maybe suppose you want to cruise faster, the vehicle will be losing power, and in the process you'll have to think twice. You might think of maybe having an issue with the engine, but then no, yes, the problem will be lying at this part, because that particular power is not coming from the engine and then being transmitted to the transmission. So it means that that power will be lost along this line. The friction that is there between this pressure plate and the friction disc will be much higher, because there is no grip between this friction disc and the pressure plate. There's so much to say about this pressure plate, but then for the sake of this video, I think we'll stop there. Now, if you have any other comments, or if you have any other suggestions on some point that I've left out, please feel free to add on top, because as I have said, we can't just say everything about this particular component. Something to remember is that this particular component is so important because it disconnects the power from the engine to the transmission, so that you can have a smooth engagement of the gear. Again, it is so important because it helps in wheel start, and again it helps in balancing of the gears on a steep takeoff. That's all for today. Feel free to add more on what I've not covered. Thank you.